the Kosovo War, and we have one of the nation's true authorities on the subject, Ivo Daalder. You've seen him on television, or you've read something that he's written about contemporary affairs, I'm sure. And in addition to the commentaries that you see, he's the author or co-author of 8 books. He's a specialist in national security, American foreign policy, and European security affairs, as is reflected by his books. He was born at The Hague in the Netherlands. He was educated at Oxford and Georgetown universities, received his MIT and his PhD from MIT. I wonder what it's like to receive an MIT. But in any case, it's a wonderful institution from which he received his degree. Dr. Daalder was on the faculty at the University of Maryland for a period of time in the School of Public Affairs. He also was director of the Center for Research in International Affairs and Security Affairs. He also was at the National Security Council 95 to 96, where he was Director of European Affairs, but he was responsible for coordinating our policy in Bosnia. He's been at the Brookings Institution and as a senior fellow in the study of foreign policy for the past several years. But in order to give you some flavor of his intellectual interests and to introduce him properly, let me refer to the subject matter of his books. He's written in the area of strategy. He's written on the subject of strategic defenses, a book published in 91, on flexible response, NATO and nuclear theater forces. He's written on arms control. And he has an ongoing project now on missile defense policy and politics. He's also written a book, U.S. and Europe in Global Affairs, or the Global Arena. And with respect to the topic tonight, he has written Getting to Dayton, which is the making of American foreign policy. His forthcoming, or actually it's just recently published a couple of days ago, his book Winning Ugly, War to Save Kosovo. And Winning Ugly has nothing to do with the ballpark over here to our right. A book with a great title, Force, Order, and Global Governance, which reminds us of the questions of the underlying rationale of the policies of the present time. And he's working on a project with Professor Dessler at the University of Maryland on the past, present, and future of the National Security Council. And he also serves on the U.S. Commission for National Security in the 21st Century. I think that the books nicely illustrate a range of interests. And of course, we're deeply interested in the rationale of the Kosovo War, as is most of the nation. And it has tremendous implications for the future of American foreign policy. So with that said, let me present to you Dr. Ivo Daalder.
Thanks for that very kind introduction. Wish my mother could hear it. She would believe. She finally know what I'll be doing every day. I should mention that the book that I have just published, called Winning Ugly, NATO's War to Save Kosovo, is co-authored with my Brookings institution colleague, Mike O'Hanlon. And while I'm solely responsible for what I'm saying here, all mistakes are his. This is a topic that most of you will either know about, and if you don't, certainly will have strong opinions about. So I wanted to be brief and give you the opportunity to fire away at any part of Kosovo, its past, present, and even its future. And I will try to hold forth. But just as an introduction, about a year ago 2 days ago, a year ago on Saturday. The war in Kosovo that started on March 24th, 1999, finally came to an end. 78 days of bombing led to the fulfillment of NATO's stated objectives. Serb forces were moving out. NATO forces were starting to move in. And the refugees, the 850,000 Kosovo Albanians who had been forcefully expelled from the province in the preceding weeks and months, were starting to move back. Now, in the years since that war, scholars and diplomats and policymakers have looked at this experience in order to see what lessons could be learned and what realities we confront. And some of those lessons are relatively uncontroversial. Lessons like that it is better to intervene early rather than late because the costs of doing so are lower and the chances of success higher. Lessons like the fact that if you want to engage in a strategy of coercive diplomacy, you better have coercive threats that are in fact credible to those you are trying to coerce. The fact that if you decide or are forced to use force, it is better to do so decisively rather than in incremental, gradual fashion. And the lesson that though air power is indeed a very potent instrument, particularly modern American air power, it alone cannot guarantee victory in the kinds of conflicts that we have been engaging in the last decade of the 20th century and will presumably continue to engage in the next decades to come. And those lessons are learned. In fact, we already knew these lessons. They just happened not to have been applied in this particular case, and I'm confident they won't be applied many times in the future. But that leaves people like me, scholars and analysts, the chance to criticize those who actually engage in making decisions. What else would we do instead? But there are a number of myths that have sprung up, and I wanted to point to 3 of these, in part because they are the central conclusions or part of the central conclusions of the book that Michael Hanlon and I did, but also because I think looking at these myths critically is important to evaluate how well we have done, both during and after the war. Those myths are that the war was in fact easily avoidable, that this was a war that we shouldn't have had to fight, leaving aside the question of whether we should have fought it. There is a sentiment that this was an easily avoidable war. The second myth that I want to discuss with you is that the NATO strategy that was employed during the war was hampered by political micromanagement by the European allies, that it was a war by committee fought by 19 different countries that were vetoing targets left and right, and that's why this was not a war that was worth fighting, was fought very effectively. And the third myth, probably the most prevalent one, is that NATO may well have won the war, but it is losing the peace. And I want to talk about that for a couple of minutes as well. The first myth, war was easily avoidable. It is true that a more apt strategy, a better diplomacy in the years preceding the war, particularly from about late 1995 onwards, probably would have been more successful than what we ended up with. In particular, the decision by the U.S. administration to rely on Slobodan Milosevic, the Serb president and leader of the self-declared Yugoslav Republic, to rely on Milosevic as the principal means for securing the cooperation of Serbs in the implementation of Dayton created a problem for U.S. policy. Because we needed Milosevic in Bosnia, it was therefore very difficult to confront him on the question of Kosovo and the question of who had leverage over whom. Did we have power over Mr. Milosevic to get him to agree to with our views on what should happen in Kosovo, or did he have leverage over us, over the question of what he would want to do in Bosnia? Was one that stymied our efforts to get Milosevic to move away from a policy of apartheid within Kosovo towards a new political formula in which the Kosovo Albanians, which represented 90% or more of the population, would have at least some say in their political future. We did not have the capacity really, to push Milosevic as far as probably was necessary for him to accept such a political fortune, because we relied upon him for the implementation of Dayton. I'd be happy to answer whether later on go into the question of whether that was necessary, but it was a fact that we did. The second reason is why we in fact, did not pay sufficient attention to Kosovo, even though Kosovo was an area that everybody, from the president on down, knew was a major potential tinderbox in the Balkans, is that in experience in government is that people who are busy pay attention to those things that are in the inbox that says immediate as opposed to important. And the immediate always crowds out the important, and it is not to be excused, but it is to be understandable that one does not really pay attention, sufficient attention, until crises happen, until violence emerges, until the need for action becomes inexorable. But even when that happened in March 1998, I would argue, at that point we still had the ability to influence this crisis in a manner short of having to go to war. A credible threat of force that we had, in fact, already threatened back in December of 1992, reiterated in March or April or May of 1998, before tempers and sentiment inside Kosovo had become so set and so polarized, might well have been able to deliver the two sides to a bargaining table and a political solution. So, in our view, and the likelihood, the possibility that a war could have been avoided by smarter diplomacy, and indeed smarter strategy, in the late 1990s exists. However, critics who argue that well into 1999, in fact up to the day the war started, better and smarter diplomacy could have avoided the war are, in my view, wrong. They go too far. If you look back at what happened from the summer of 1998 on into the spring of 1999 in Kosovo, it was becoming clearer and clearer that this was a conflict that was going to be solved one way or the other through the use of force. And the question was, whose force would prevail? Milosevic's force versus the KLA, the Kosovo Liberation Army, the Kosovo Liberation Army versus the Serbs, or a third NATO force intervening. And by late October, early November 1998, it was clear from the Serb side that this was going to be solved by their use of force vis-a-vis the Kosovo Liberation Army. They had tried to rely in the negotiation that Milosevic had conducted with Richard Holbrooke in October of 1998 on an international presence to somehow find a way to solve this problem in the short term. That hadn't worked, and Milosevic by late October, early November 1998 decided that his force, was the way to resolve this conflict. This is when the infamous Operation Horseshoe, the plan that the Serbs developed for dealing with the KLA and much of the ethnic Albanian population as well, was developed. From that point on, Milosevic was only going to be stopped one way, and that was by superior military force. Those who would argue that a more subtle, a better diplomacy at Rambouillet, the French castle where there were for 2.5 weeks intense discussions mediated by the United States and others, that those discussions would have been better handled by more skillful diplomats, as some would argue, and with more tact would have led to a peaceful conclusion. Those people, I believe, are wrong. This was not a question of whether Madeleine Albright could deliver a peace agreement, or could not deliver a peace agreement where clearly Richard Holbrooke would have, as some believe, including Richard Holbrooke himself. This was fundamentally a question of two sides wanting a territory and each willing to fight to get it. And when you have that situation, you probably cannot solve, in fact, in this case, cannot solve the problem through negotiations. The only way this conflict at that point could have been resolved was through the superior application of military force. Sometimes conflicts in world affairs require military force. Not every conflict is subject to negotiation. at least at certain points in time. That's myth number one. Myth number two, that NATO's war strategy was impaired, indeed undermined, by the political micromanagement of our European allies. The charge is that this was a war by committee, that this was a war fought by 19 heads of state who were questioning each target, that the NATO military commanders were hamstrung by having to supply their targets to the political leaders, and that the Prime Minister of Iceland, and I presume it is a Prime Minister rather than a Chancellor, could veto any target that our B-2 bombers would be able to hit. As Secretary Cohen has said, but for the Allies, we would have engaged in a much more intensive, much more massively strong and decisive air campaign. As Lieutenant General Michael Short, the man who ran the air campaign, said, France vetoed so many targets that our pilots were at risk. Well, excuse me, Secretary Cohen and General Short, but you're wrong. The facts just don't bear it out. And interestingly, in fact, General Clark, who ran the war, was at the Brookings Institution 3 days ago, on Thursday, confirmed once again that the notion that this was a war by committee, that this was a war in which individual targets were reviewed by every one of the political leaders, is just simply wrong. The strategy that NATO embarked upon, a phased air campaign, was indeed approved by the 19 NATO governments in October 1998, almost 6 months before the war started. The decision to use force was approved by the 19, and so it should be. If an alliance goes to war, should not political leaders make the decision on whether or not to use force? That clearly was the case. The decision to escalate from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 2.5, which is where it stayed, was approved by the North Atlantic Council, which is the political representatives of the individual governments. And indeed, when we move from attacking forces in the field to attacking Belgrade, should not our political leaders then make a decision on whether or not to do that? And it was done by March 30th, 1999, 6 days into the war. From that point onwards, no political leader other than the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and the President of France ever saw a target, never saw a target list, ever was asked for their opinion. And when the TV towers in Belgrade were bombed, the Prime Minister of the Netherlands had no idea that that was going to be on the target list. The Prime Minister of Britain did, the President of France did, and the President of the United States did. These three leaders insisted and were granted the right to review individual targets in a certain categories. That was the right granted to them as being the major powers in NATO. Unfair, to be sure. Micromanaged? Hardly. Would you not want the President of the United States to be aware what his pilots are going to hit when the target being hit may result in large-scale civilian casualties? Or if it involves a target in Montenegro, involves a escalation of the war? Of course you would want political leaders to be aware of that. That's hardly micromanagement, that's common sense. But to argue that that is the same as the political interference of all NATO members, that this was somehow a war by committee, that was undermining an effective military strategy is wrong. More importantly, the strategy that was employed of a phased air campaign that excluded the use of ground forces from day one publicly was a strategy not only agreed to by the United States, it was a strategy devised by the United States. This was an American-devised strategy, devised for specific American political reasons, having to do with the administration's perspective on Congress and what the public could support, and that was the strategy that was implemented. This was not the strategy that the United States reluctantly accepted. Gradual escalation, which is what it was something that the United States engaged in. And why did it support this strategy? For a simple reason. There was widespread agreement, a widespread assumption at the highest levels of the U.S. government that Mr. Milosevic was a schoolyard bully that if hit over the head would quit. That if only you dropped a couple of bombs, be it in Belgrade or near Belgrade, it would be over. Madeleine Albright on March 24th went on the Lehrer NewsHour and said this will be a short operation. 78 days is not a short operation. That clearly was not the intent. of Mr. Milosevic, but it was the belief that led to us having this strategy. How do we know? We know because we only had 90 targets ready to hit, 3 days worth. After the 3 days, General Clark had to scramble for more targets. He had to scramble for more airplanes. We ended up, at the end of the war, with 3 times the number of airplanes that we had when we started the war. In fact, if we were really serious about a long, sustained air campaign, why, on March 15th, 9 days before the war started, did we pull out our only aircraft carrier from the Mediterranean? Most countries don't go to war in a sustained effort by pulling out their aircraft carrier. They've, in fact, sent more aircraft carriers. We didn't do that because we didn't believe this was going to be a long war. And the strategy of gradualism was built on the assumption that Milosevic would cave. I'll be happy to answer and go into deeper detail why people thought that this was the case. But to blame our allies for this strategy is to have our history upside down. Myth number 3. NATO may have won the war, but it is losing the peace. And anybody who picked up this morning's Washington Post, or indeed almost any newspaper in the country in the last weeks or so, would have found that a lot of people are still being killed in Kosovo. A large article in the Post described the continuation of ethnic killing, of Albanians killing Serbs, Serbs killing Albanians in the most horrendous ways one can think of. Indeed, 500 plus people have died since NATO troops entered. Ethnic segregation of Serbs from Albanians has not only continued but accelerated. More Serbs have left the country. More Roma and Gypsies have left. This is becoming a mono-ethnic state, largely populated by Albanians, and wherever there are Serbs, they live in enclaves, and increasingly segregated. Indeed, Kosovo today hardly is the model of multi-ethnic democracy that one would like to see. But whoever thought that Kosovo should be a model of multi-ethnic democracy? It would be nice to have a multi-ethnic democracy in Kosovo. It would be nice to have a multi-ethnic democracy in the Sudan. It would be nice to have one in Sierra Leone. It would be nice to have one in Bosnia. But that's not really why I think we went to war. It's certainly not why I supported going to war. We went to war because a government was terrorizing its civilians. It happened to be Albanian civilians and a Serb government, but fundamentally it was about the fact that one government used the monopoly of its own power to expel an entire population from a province. We did not go to war to establish a multi-ethnic democracy in a place that it was never multi-ethnic, nor ever democratic. It is very difficult to create multi-ethnic states. In fact, you don't create them, they emerge. And it is exceedingly difficult to create democracies. In fact, you don't create them, they develop over time. And for us to argue that the standard of judgment on whether we are succeeding in Kosovo today is whether or not a multi-ethnic democracy has emerged would be wrong. I hasten to add that the administration and the international community writ large has set as its goal, at least it used to, it doesn't talk about it anymore, but it used to talk about the goal in Kosovo being to create a multi-ethnic democracy. I think they're being hoisted on their own petard here. They are not going to create a multi-ethnic democracy. They're going to create a state, at most, in which people may be able to live in some degree of security, and unlikely to do so by having Albanians and Serbs in the same apartment building. That's regrettable. It's not something that you and I would like to see in any society, but it's better than them killing each other. And ultimately, our real interest in this part of the world is saving lives, is making sure that people do not kill each other. The refugees that were outside of Kosovo returned. In fact, the largest movement of people in Europe occurred, since World War II, occurred from June 10th to July 31st. 850,000 people went home. That's a major achievement, even if, and in the process as the Albanians were moving, 100,000 plus Serbs moved out. Some because they feared what was about to come, others because they were forced out by force of arms or others. That was the reality in Kosovo then. It is a reality in Kosovo today. The NATO troops are there. in order to provide some semblance of public order, but they can't protect everybody. You and I wouldn't want to pay the kind of military and police presence you would want to have or need to have to protect every single Serb and every single Albanian against the possibility of reprisal in a society that went through 10 years of apartheid and 1 year of war. If you compare to what was there and what is there now, things are pretty good. A year ago, there was a war, and a year ago, the 850,000 Albanians were forced out of their homes outside of the country. A year ago, 500,000 Albanians were living outside of their homes. Today, they're all back. Those who survived, Serbs have left in some numbers, in significant numbers, in too great a numbers. There's ethnic segregation. There are divided cities. There is murder and mayhem at rates that are no different than Washington, D.C., but nevertheless, that should not be the standard that we all ought to aspire to. This is not a great situation, but compared to where we were, it is a much better situation. So to argue that the peace has been lost is to say that the peace depends on a fiction of building a multi-ethnic democracy, which we're not likely to build anytime soon, if ever. With that, I'll be happy to take your questions.
Thanks very much for the overview. Yes, ma'am. What do you perceive the future of Mr. Milosevic?
I think Milosevic is going to stay for a while. He has nowhere to go. He's an indicted war criminal, rightly so. He is responsible for heinous acts, or at least he has been indicted for heinous acts for which he ought to be tried, and he ought to get a fair trial in The Hague, but he's not going to go to The Hague freely. It may be that the Chinese Prime Minister, or number 2, Mr. Li Peng, who's now in Belgrade, will give him free passage to Beijing, and that's one way to get rid of him, but that would complicate our relationship with Beijing, I would imagine. He's likely to stay. I think he is, at the moment, secure in his power, contrary to what many had hoped and thought would happen by the isolation that sanctions would be placing on him. I think he's so secure in his power now that he's shutting down the media without any problem of the opposition. He has an opposition that is thoroughly incompetent and corrupt. I mean, any politician ought to have an opposition like that. They get reelected. And he might, in fact, be reelected if there were elections in Serbia itself. But you do have, and it was just today talking to a journalist who spent most of the last year and a half in Belgrade, you do have a sense that this is the end of the regime is somewhere near. Nobody can travel anymore. They don't really, they know they're isolated. But since they have nowhere else to go, they're going to stay. And the penalty of staying is not that large. They have large stacks of money that they're using freely. They're benefiting from the economy being shut down. They are very good at smuggling. They've always been good at smuggling. They're particularly good when there's a black market that has come out because of the sanctions. So I think I wouldn't be surprised if he stays for quite a while. I wouldn't be surprised if he'd be thrown out tomorrow either. I mean, this is not a situation you want to live in. But the notion that he's reeling and he's about to go, I think may have been true last year, but it isn't true anymore.
2 questions. The first is why wasn't Congress asked to declare war? And then secondly, who now controls the mineral resources of Kosovo?
Whether fortunately or unfortunately, this country hasn't declared war since 1941. Sure. The way in which we have tried to deal with it ever since is for the President to go to the Congress and ask for their support. That is not the same as what the Constitution prescribes, but that is what we did in 1991 when we came to the Gulf War. It's what we did in 1964 to our great regret in the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and it is what the President asked the Congress to do, and the Senate, in fact, did vote the day before the vote on March 23rd to support airstrikes. The House refused to vote. It then, in mid-April, did vote. It voted not to support airstrikes, not to authorize ground troops, not to declare war, and not to call our troops back home. And then it voted to spend $13 billion about double the amount that the president had asked for in support of our troops. And if you understand what the House wanted, then you knew more about it than I. You, well, we don't know what the American people want if the Congress doesn't want to vote. And there's only that much that the president can do. He is faced with the question of whether or not to act in his role as commander-in-chief, which is also a constitutional role. And if the Congress refuses to act or act in such a way that says, don't move backwards, don't move forwards, and don't stand there, it becomes very difficult for the president to figure out what to do. As regards the mineral wealth, the mines, which are in the north in Mitrovica, are about now half in a sector that the Serbs are occupying or live in, and half in the Albanian sector. It's not operating. The mine is owned by, since this is a socialist economy, by the state. The problem is that the state that operates in Kosovo no longer operates, that the Yugoslav state no longer has any authority over Kosovo. Fundamental problem that the United Nations and as the international administrator of Kosovo faces is that it, on the one hand, is not the sovereign power, which remains in Belgrade. On the other hand, it is not able and or allowed to deal with the sovereign power. And yet, in an economy that is largely state-run, things need to move on. So do you take the mine and give it away or sell it or what? It's a very difficult problem. And so far, they have not been able to resolve the question of who owns the mine, who operates it. More importantly is that there is a general agreement that whatever mineral wealth is there is not economically sustainable to mine, and that there's a great exaggeration by both Serbs and Albanians what the economic viability of the mine itself is.
Would you please assess the Russian diplomatic role before, during, and after the beginning of the war?
I think the Russian role was one crucial to the solution of the war. It was nefarious at other parts, typical in that sense. But in general, I think I would make a distinction between Russia and, at that point, its president and chief Balkan sponsor, Mr. Chernomyrdin. Russia's reaction to the war was highly negative, even though it had signed up to the strategy that led to the war. Russia was a part of the strategy that was developed. It was the strategy developed by the contact group, of which it was a member. The strategy said that we will begin negotiations with the Serbs and the Kosovars, and if that does not work, we will take further action, military action explicitly. The Russians signed up to the threat, but not to the reality of military action. Once the war started, Russia was upset, to say the least. Public opinion in Russia turned very, very sharply against the United States, the first time it actually did on the issue, for example, of NATO enlargement, which had upset the Russian policy elite. The public couldn't care less. But on this one, they did care. At the same time, Yeltsin made the political calculation about a month into the war that ending the war was the most important thing, and making sure there would be no ground war was even more important. And he spent, through Chernomyrdin, who became his special envoy in mid-April, together with Strobe Talbot, our Deputy Secretary of State, and the Finnish President Martti Ahtisaari, who represented the European Union, in about a month they worked through to a common position, which basically was a translation of NATO's position into a peace agreement. And the Russian role was absolutely critical in the following sense. Russia's support for NATO, in the end, is what told Milosevic that he had no political room to go anymore. If you think of Milosevic being driven by air power in the war into a dead-end corridor which had two doors, one a military escape door and the other a political escape door. The military escape door was the prospect of a ground invasion, which I think was closing by late May, early June. The political escape door was Russia, and Russians slammed it straight into his face on June 2nd when they said that, in effect, they were going to support NATO no matter what came on the question of what needed to be done in order to end the war. And that Russian decision to support NATO was critical for Milosevic to realize the game was up, and he caved.
What is the prognosis if we had not intervened?
Well, that's a counterfactual question to which I do not really know the answer, but I have my guesses. Um, we know that from about early February onwards, he was massing his troops in and around Kosovo. There were about 40,000 troops and about 25,000 police by the time the war started, armed with about 1,500 heavy weapons. This is major stuff. This is no peanuts. The Operation Horseshoe, the plan that the U.S. the NATO military acquired, found secretly in February, late February, suggested that if you look at Kosovo, which is a sort of a square on a corner, he was going to take the area from the northwest around to the south and then back to the around to the west and then back out around to the east and then back to the southwest, and basically empty it of the Albanian population. That was the plan in order to deal a rapid blow to the KLA. He was confident, and he told General Clark and others that he would be able to do this in 5 days. And the Yugoslav army was slightly less confident. They said 5 to 7 days. And in fact, they did it in 5 to 7 days. They basically emptied that part of the country and then started emptying Pristina and Prizren, the other big cities, by early April. They were done by April 6, 7, which is about 2 weeks into the war. So the question is, would they have done that if we hadn't bombed? And my assumption is that he wouldn't have done it as quickly, but he would have done it. The Serbs were claiming that a village a day keeps NATO away, that if you do it slowly, you would be able, this is not a NATO statement, this is a Serb statement, NATO would not intervene. And I think in the end he would have done the same kind of damage. The consequences then being that you had 850,000 people outside of Kosovo who had to be accommodated in one way or another. And there's also the possibility, given his record, perhaps the likelihood that he would have killed a hell of a lot more people. This is a man who supported and was directly engaged in the killings in Srebrenica, where in 7 days they killed 7,000 people. This is not somebody you want to take for dinner, even though some people go over there for dinner. It is not a nice guy. And one, given his record, ought to assume that things would go terribly, terribly badly, even though you don't know for sure whether that would have been the case.
Two questions. The first, how close was President Clinton to ordering ground troops in? NPR has speculated he was very close.
Well, they said days, if not hours.
Right, days if not hours. Secondly, with respect to recovery in Kosovo, the alleged fact is that agricultural production is back to 80 or 90% of what it was.
Let me take the last question because I don't know the answer, but I suspect it's wrong. The refugees came back in June and July. They spent most of the time rebuilding their homes in order to survive the winter. They needed a roof over their heads. Many of the fields had mines, so you're now only this year, in this spring, starting to recover the agriculture. I don't think they did a lot last year. And I'd be astonished if they had done 80 to 90% just in the last 2 or 3 months, but they may well have. I mean, this is not a place in which there is an ongoing war, despite what you might read in newspapers. This is not a place where this is not the Wild West out there. There's normal activity, even though as a Serb you don't want to run around in Albanian neighborhoods and vice versa. It's not safe in that sense, but in daily life is going on, and it's booming in many ways. On the invasion, I believe the president was days away from a decision. He has said so publicly. We record in our book in quite excruciating detail about how close we got in terms of the decision. Remember, the Serbs were presented with the peace plan by the Finnish president and the Russian envoy on June 2nd, which they accepted then and was voted on June 3rd. And on June 3rd, the Yugoslav parliament accepted, the Serb parliament accepted the peace plan, and from then on you had negotiation. But June 3rd was the critical date. June 2nd, there were meetings at the White House the entire day, first with public people and then with administration people, to discuss what kind of options we had on ground forces. And that night, Sandy Berger, the White House National Security Advisor, composed a memo in what he recalls to have been his most difficult night in the White House, and since he was there since day one, that's a lot of nights, basically arguing that we had three options left. One, to arm the KLA, but that would only fuel the fire for the next 20 years. Secondly, to wait till spring, but you had the problem of the likelihood of many hundreds of thousands of internally displaced people then succumbing to the winter. And third, to invade, and if so, to invade with the kind of force and plan that General Clark had been developing over the preceding weeks and months. And it was his recommendation that, in fact, that was the only option left. That was going to be discussed the next day with the President and the Joint Chiefs. And it was believed that in the course of the next week, the President would have had to make a decision in order then to get a NATO decision in time for, in order to give the military time enough to plan the invasion and to bring the troops in. So we were very close. Now, I think it's important to know that even though the President has said he would have decided to do this publicly, and we have a variety of other sources, he never made that decision because he didn't have to. And this is a decision that gets made once, and it's only at that point that we know for certain what would happen, and this is a tough decision. This would have meant sending 100 to 125,000 Americans into Kosovo. Not an easy decision for any president. Not an easy decision for this president, who hasn't sent American troops into combat since Somalia in 1993, to take. So you got to remember that the decision wasn't taken. But we were that close presenting the president with the decision, and my belief in the end, the president, it is clear, believed that you could not lose this war. That the consequences of losing for the region, for the United States, for the people, was so high that even sending 125,000 troops was worth it.
Is reconciliation in Kosovo possible? Is territorial division a practical answer? What's being done?
You know, lots of attempts at reconciliation are being made. There's a local administration being set up in which Albanians and Serbs have been asked to join in. There's a police force training academy that has invited Serbs to be part of the police force. There are all kinds of efforts to try to get the two peoples to talk to each other, but it's very difficult. It's in fact, it's not working very well. So the question of whether one ought to partition off perhaps the north, which is largely Serbian populated at the moment, has come up. The real problem is it's not clear where two problems. One is not clear where you draw the line. There are Albanians living in Serbia, in the Presevo Valley on the western side of, on the eastern side of Kosovo. Which used to be part of Kosovo 75 years ago. Do you make that part of Kosovo? Do you trade that territory? Once you start trading territory, it becomes very complicated. Doable, but then you still would need to enforce it. You still need a police force in order to make sure that the border's there. This is not a solution for us to get out. In fact, there is no solution for us to get out. Get used to it. We're getting in. We're staying for a very long time. That's one problem. Where do you draw the border? How do you do this? This is not easy. Second is, what do you do with the Albanian part? The Albanians, the Kosovar Albanians don't want to be part of Albania. That's a failed state. It's, you know, in many ways much poorer. It doesn't work as well. Why be part of that? Most Albanians in Albania would like to be part of Kosovo, but not vice versa. If you do that, what about the Albanians in Macedonia? Would they like to join that too? And what do you do with Macedonia at that point? If you make Kosovo independent, not part of Albania, how does the state organize itself? How does it become economically and politically viable? Tough questions. The international community, quite frankly, isn't ready yet to even ask these questions, let alone beginning to answer them. In part because the situation isn't really ripe to even think about it. And it'll take quite a while before we get to that point. I mean, my personal view is the notion of having the Kosovar Albanians being governed by Belgrade, even a post-Milosevic Belgrade, doesn't strike me as very realistic. But it's also, at the moment, not an issue that really has to be faced because they're governed by the United Nations for all practical purposes, whether we like it or not. And the police force is us. and we're likely, therefore, to stay for a very long time. And at the moment, I don't think that's too much of a problem.
Would you comment on the future of Montenegro?
If I had a prognosis of what would happen in Montenegro, I'd be a rich man. I think Montenegro is a very tough problem, because this, unlike any other of the former Yugoslav republics, is one that is deeply divided, almost 50-50, 60-40, within its own ethnic population about its own status. Every other problem, we had Croats who wanted to be independent, and the Serbs who lived in Croatia who didn't. The same with Bosnia, the same in Kosovo. This is a problem where the Montenegrins themselves are deeply divided between those who want to stay as part of the Yugoslav Federation and those who either want greater independence or complete independence. So this is not where you support one ethnic group against another ethnic group. This is a fundamental political problem. That's one part, which makes it tough and difficult. Second part, which makes it tough and difficult, is that we, the international community, have instituted a set of rules and guidelines for how former republics of Yugoslavia become independent. And that's how Macedonia and Bosnia and Slovenia and Croatia become independent. And Montenegro is a former republic of the former Yugoslavia. And that is that there are two fundamental requirements. There has to be a referendum, which the majority votes for independence. And secondly, there has to be some laws that guarantee minority rights. Well, there are very few minorities in Montenegro. There are some Albanians and some Muslims, but few. A bunch of Serbs, but many, it's primarily Montenegrin province. So all you need, in effect, is a referendum. And we know that if there's a referendum in Montenegro, it'll go in favor of independence, even though the margin will be small. Under our own rules, we would have to support independence and recognize this independent state. Once you recognize an independent state, and it gets attacked at that point from Serbia, a foreign country, it has the right, under the Charter of the United Nations, to defend itself and to ask the international community to come to its assistance under Article 51. So the problem is we don't want to really get involved in another war, and we also don't want to encourage the Montenegrins to take the one step that we have recognized as the right step to take, because that will likely lead not only to a war, but one in which we would have to come to their defense. This is a tough one. That's why if I knew what would happen, I would be a rich man. I think, however, that what we need to do is we have to balance this one. And I have to start making very clear to both the Serbs and the Montenegrins that on the one hand, we believe that this is an issue that is best resolved without a formal declaration of independence. And on the other hand, if there is violence that is perpetrated from Belgrade, we will intervene. We will intervene on Montenegro's side. We will take the Article 51 chapter notion of the right to collective self-defense, and not only will we intervene, we will go on and intervene until the regime of Belgrade is changed, because at some point, the international community has to say that it's time to get to the source of the problem. The source of this problem is not ancient ethnic hatreds. The source of the problem is bad leadership. Corrupt leadership run by Mr. Milosevic, who has ridden the nationalist tiger to power, and he keeps on riding it to power and maintaining his power over the last 11 years now. And at some point, we ought to get rid of the guy. That will mean that we were even more entrenched in the Balkans, because the only way you get rid of that person is to go to Belgrade and stay there for a while. But I don't see the alternative is to do this over and over and over again. At some point, everybody's going to get sick of these wars.
The question is, why the difference between the peaceful, stable days of Tito and the present?
The short answer is Tito, but there's a longer answer. Tito, one, understood that nationalism was a fundamental problem in Yugoslavia, and he made communism, and actually quite liberal communism compared to other communism, the unifying element in what was otherwise a highly disunited Yugoslavia. That was fine so long as the economic prospects of the country and the people moved more or less in lockstep and upwards. I mean, people who are happy and fed are likely to fight with each other even if they're different. What changed after Tito's death was, one, that Tito died, but so one of the unifying elements, a man who had won the war for them in the partisan war in World War II, died. But secondly, that as revolutionary change swept through Eastern Europe with the end of communism and the end, ultimately, of the Soviet Union, an economic downturn, severe economic downturn, was hitting Yugoslavia. And you had a combination of the end of the unifying ideal with economic distress. And economic distress is a major, the economic distress was also unevenly distributed. You had the Slovenes and the Croats, who were much richer and much better off than the Bosnians and the Serbs and the Montenegrins and the Macedonians, and didn't want any longer to support the larger percentage of the population. And you then had people who used nationalism as a means to come to political power. Nationalism is a powerful sentiment for those who don't have anything else. If you don't have food, if you can't promise economic prosperity, promise economic nationalist hatred. Serbs, we need to stand up because it is these blood-sucking Muslims who are getting, et cetera, et cetera. That's how the thing falls apart. And it did so very quickly. A combination of economic distress and an unwillingness to transform politically and economically. This is still the only socialist communist place in Europe. Even Albania, which is nothing, and doesn't have a communist economy, but the Serbs still do. It's a command economy run by the state, not in Croatia and Slovenia anymore. So, economic dislocation and smart but evil political leadership leads to problems like these. And that's how you get Sarajevans who are living Muslim next to Serb in inter-ethnic marriage to disappear in the way that it did. Remember, though, that in Kosovo, unlike in Sarajevo, where there was a large degree of intermarriage, in your average apartment building, there was every nationality, every ethnic group lived there, every religion lived there. In Kosovo, there was hardly any intermarriage. This was not a multi-ethnic society in the sense that you and I would think of a multi-ethnic society. Highly segregated, even before the war and even back into in Tito's time.
Can you give us a projection from someone about the length of time that forces will have to remain in Kosovo?
Finnish president, former president Ahtisaari said generations. My own estimate is we've been in Korea since 1950. We've been in the Sinai since 1979. We've been in Germany since 1945. We're going to be in the Balkans for decades. Small, contingent. And I think that's, quite frankly, what, our presence, military and otherwise, in Europe is now largely determined by what's happening in southeastern Europe. We have 68,000 troops in Germany. Germany is surrounded by NATO allies. It is not going to be attacked. And if it is, we don't know which one we're going to support. Okay? So we can take some of those troops and rotate them into Tuzla and into Camp Bonesteel, which has I'm told, a perfectly flat, wonderful bowling alley. I mean, we have a permanent military base there. We build it, we spend a lot of money on it. And we will be there. That's what the United States military does. We've been in Japan since 1950. Okinawa? Why do we need 100,000 troops in Okinawa? Who's going to attack the Japanese tomorrow? We're there because we want to provide reassurance to the Japanese. We're in Germany because we wanted to find reassurance to the Germans. I don't think it's terribly bad to have 5,000, 10,000 soldiers on a rotating basis providing reassurance to southeastern Europe that the kind of atrocities that we witnessed in the 90s are not going to be acceptable in the 21st century.
5,000 or 10,000 American troops?
Americans, yeah.
Foreign troops?
No, I think, the total number of troops you're talking about. One, I don't think the United States should have the majority. I think they should have a small portion. They have a small portion. The total number of troops in the Balkans, you take Bosnia and Kosovo, is now on the order of about 55,000, of which the United States deploys about 8. I think that total will go down. They're going to try to make this a unified command, and it will go down perhaps to half. And our presence will be somewhere around 5,000. That's a rotating presence. We have 1,000 troops in the Sinai since 1979, 21 years. Anybody protesting? Anybody think that's the wrong thing to do? Not as long as we think it's important to be engaged in the world. We ought to be able to afford part of our European deployment to go into this part of the world.
Does the bombing of the embassy in Belgrade indicate that the State Department should have more technically trained people?
I might have gotten my PhD at MIT, but it was in political science. And the numbers that I used was page numbers and footnote numbers. I think the bombing of the Beijing embassy suggests, one, that if you go to war, figure out your target set before you do so. One of the main reasons why we bombed the Beijing embassy, in my view, which I do think was a mistake, though an awful one it was because we scrambled to get more targets. We didn't have any targets because we thought the war was going to be over in 3 days. If you're going to use force in a major way, you better figure out how this war is going to end. And as they were scrambling for targets, they asked the CIA for targets, and this was the one target that came out of the CIA, which makes it even more suspect. The second thing I would do is if you work at the CIA and your total intelligence budget is $31 billion, invest in going online so you can check out Belgrade maps online, because if you go online to Belgrade and do a map finding, you will find that the Beijing embassy is where it says it is. And buy new maps. I mean, that's not silly, but if you want to know what a snafu really looks like, this is one of them.
Unfortunately, it's time to end the session. I know there are more questions, and I apologize to those of you who didn't get a chance to ask any. But for sharing your most impressive knowledge based upon a lot of research and a lot of practical experience, you've done us a tremendous service by being with us this evening. We thank you very much. Good show. Thank you.